Well, good morning. It's great to be here. I have had plenty of coffee this morning. I hope you have. So keep up with me. I'm really here to tell you kind of the environmental story, the journey in evangelicalism, and it's a pretty wild story actually. I don't know that I have it all exactly right, and because our time's short together, I'm going to be speaking in great generalizations, and so I without a lot of detail, but I want to tell you this story from my perspective. I was sort of raised up through the story. I was a part of the story, have been a part of the story, still am a part of the story, I think, and I don't think the story is over. But I want to go back to when I was 16 years old. I found myself at age 16 on the side of a mountain. For the very first time, I had been in solitude for a couple of days. Most 16-year-olds have never been in any solitude, because they can't even get away from their video games or iPhones. But and I found it was a great challenge for me at 16. When I was 16, my dad, he was principal of Beverly Hills High School, and so I came from Southern California, San Fernando Valley, and yet we had a mountain cabin about an hour and a half out of Los Angeles, up towards the Sierra Nevadas and the Tehachapi Mountains. Been in my family for many years, and my gift for my 16th birthday was a 65 Volkswagen Bug, straight from Germany, still in kilometers, and the freedom to drive it for the first time to this remote ranch and spend 3 days alone. And after about an hour, I didn't know what to do with myself, and I had chopped wood, I'd done everything I knew to do, and I was sitting there and already extremely bored, and took a walk up on the mountain behind me, and I found myself out on a knoll, breaking out of this pine grove into this open area, looking across in this particular place. It was breathtaking, really, looking across the Antelope Valley, which is really the western finger of the Mojave Desert as it came in to the Tehachapi Mountains and the Sierra Nevadas. And it was just as the sun was setting. And I remember that moment in my life as I looked at that, raised actually in mainline Protestantism, but yet never really understanding my faith, never really knowing about the reality of God. And yet at that moment, as I looked across this incredible trajectory of beauty, I knew in that moment that this couldn't be an accident. I mean, it was just a revelation as a young man, and you never know, in your life until 50 years later as you look back how significant a moment can be. I actually wrote about it later, even as I was still 16, about that, of what God had done in my heart, and realizing that he had revealed himself to me in that place, still with much confusion about a lot of the Christian faith, but coming at least to that place of knowing God exists. And because I am a good evangelical, I am going to give you a little scripture that I think is really significant. Paul writes this as he opens to the Romans, and speaking about people who have rejected God, said, let them be a living they know the truth about God because he has made it obvious to them. For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and sky through everything God made. They can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power, and his divine nature, so they have no excuse for not knowing God. For an evangelical, that's a powerful scripture. And really speaking to a people that say that their heart is to evangelize, that their heart is to proclaim who God is to the world, that they would really bring this vehicle that God has provided to the forefront instead of quenching it and pushing it down. But as many of you know in this room, that's happened in evangelicalism in many ways through the years. So I want to try to explain that. As best I know, in my story, soon after that happened to me, I went off to university. I went to the College of Idaho to get my master's degree and my undergraduate work. met my wife there, and actually returned to the ranch and lived there, actually with no electricity, in a very remote setting there on the ranch for 14 years, raised our family there for 20 years, became a school teacher, taught ecology and science in the secondary level during those years. But on the college campus in those days, I mean, it was a great turmoil. It was 1967, 1968, 1969. I was married in 1970. And those of you who were aware of the 60s, you know it was a crazy and a confusing and yet a historical time. It was a time of great cultural disjuncture in our generation, the baby boomer generation. We were confused. We were looking for truth. We were looking for meaning. Everywhere we saw, there was a mistrust for authority. There was an anger towards the establishment, towards a presidency that had lied to us and that we didn't think that we could trust. We were fighting a war that we didn't understand, and friends of ours were dying on a daily basis. We were starting an age of technology that we didn't understand the end yet. We just had seen a man walk on the moon. We knew that things were changing. There was a declining global environment, and we were aware of that. And these things started emerging through our music, through our poetry, through our protests, through our behavior. We were crying out for truth, and we were crying out for meaning. A book came out at that time by Paul Ehrlich called The Population Bomb. And it scared us to death, literally, to us evangelicals, scared the hell out of us, really. Because we looked at this, and we looked at the world around us, and we could see the times. When we were born, and about my age, I was born in 1948. I'm 65 now. The world population hadn't quite even reached 2 billion people. And as the population bomb was written, it was already approaching 4 billion people just in my lifetime. And I was still a very young man. And we were going and looking at the trajectories that they were saying that the world couldn't support 6 billion people, and for sure couldn't support 8 billion people. No one knew what was going to happen. We were scared and searching, and many went to the Peace Corps looking for meaning. Some entered into an emerging drug culture that was new for that time. Some turned to academia, but others turned to faith. And in the early 70s, there was a major move of Christianity that we know today as the Jesus movement. Started really in the late 60s, 1970s. And it started with our generation searching for truth, but not looking in the churches that we had been raised in for that truth because we felt that we hadn't found it when we were there. And so it took on a whole different complexion. We could go to church without shoes. We could go to church with long hair. We could go to church and not sit in a chair. We could go and sit around and study the Bible, and worship was no longer choirs but played on a guitar and in a corporate sense. We wouldn't baptize people in a typical baptismal. We had to baptize them in oceans and in rivers and places that we thought were non-conventional. And growing up, we had sprinkled, but now we were dunking. Everything was radical. And it was different, and yet it was immature. We were reading the Bible cover to cover, but our pastors were 21, 22, 23 years old. None had been to seminary. They just read the Bible the day before we had. And so we were looking for some leadership, and some emerged. Men like Hal Lindsey, who wrote the book, The Late Great Planet Earth. Maybe some of you remember that. He wrote it in 1973, I think it was. No, 1971. And at the same time came some very scary, low-budget end-time movies. But Hal Lindsey's book gave us answers to the things that we were concerned about. we recognized that the world was changing, and it was in decline, and we were wondering where it was going to go and how we were going to respond to this. And this eschatology that came through dispensational theology that emerged out of the Jesus movement at that time gave us all the answers. It spelled it out very clearly. And so we started looking to Jesus, and we started looking really to the Bible for the answers. And in the midst of it, really let go of this concern for the global environment. We let go, but the secular world didn't let go. And so in 1971, Greenpeace emerged. And there started a movement, actually started on Yale campus, called Population Zero Movement, which was a reaction to the book that had been written a few years before. Roe versus Wade came in 1973. And so there was all this turmoil and discussion, and how should we react to this, and how should we respond to that? And in the midst of this eschatological teaching that we were receiving, we came to this conclusion that many of you have heard it said, based on a passage in 2 Peter chapter 3, it's all going to burn anyway. There's nothing we can do. We're just going to sit and wait as all of this plays out. Jesus will return, we'll be raptured, and it'll all be left behind. And as a result, let go our responsibility, literally our biblical mandate and responsibility that God had literally given us to care for his creation. At the same time as Roe versus Wade took over, it gave us another battle to fight. James Dobson in 1977 established Focus on the Family and became a national voice for speaking out on behalf of evangelicals on the issues of sanctity of life. He was our champion. And two camps emerged. Because even though we let go of the environment, the secular world did not. And the secular world promoted less population and therefore the legislation of abortion. And so they became the enemy of evangelicalism. Two camps grew further apart. And no one in our camp could profess a concern about the environment because we would be told that we care more about polar bears and seals than we do about infants and the unborn. And so as many of us grew and became pastors, I was a pastor in the 80s and in the 90s and went to Idaho and planted the vineyard of Boise in 1989. All this time I had in my heart the thing that I was carrying since I was 16 years old. An understanding that God did create this and that it revealed the reality of who he was, his character, his power, his eternal nature. And I was always in conflict. I was in the closet environmentalist. I was in Boise, Idaho, probably more red state than Utah, in a capital city with legislatures sitting in my congregation, when all of a sudden, in about the year 2000, I think it was, my two adult children came to me and said, and we had a dinner debate, which I hate those, because they're smarter than I am. And we were talking about the Gore-Bush election. And over the course of the conversation that night at dinner, they said to me, "Dad, we have no one to vote for." And I said, "What do you mean? You know, you're an evangelical, you're a Republican." And then, "What do you mean you don't have it?" She goes, "No, because, and I raised my kids in the mountains. We would spend our summers building backcountry trails. Actually had a team of mules and built big stretches of the Pacific Crest Trail up through California when my children were young. Packed them in, homeschooled, and built trail through the summers. And they said, "No, we have no one to vote for because you have given us this value of loving the creation, loving the environment. And we feel that if we vote one way, we're voting against the sanctity of life, and we vote the other way, we're voting against the environment." And it really struck me. And my daughter said to me, "Dad, how come In all of the years I've been sitting in church, I've never heard one message on environmental stewardship. And it so convicted me, and it so challenged me that I went back to my Bible. And I spent 6 months reading through my Bible with a green pen. You know, you have a red letter Bible. We do. We have red letter Bible as Christians, but now I had a green letter Bible. And everywhere I saw that God had said anything about his creation and any instruction about caring for it, I started writing in green, and my Bible became pretty green. The Old Testament became really green. And after 6 months, I went to the Lord and I just said, Lord, I'm afraid. I'm afraid to do this, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to preach my first message on the environment. And I think for some it would be hard to understand the fear that a pastor in that era would feel about this. And I remember the morning I did it. And I actually used Romans 1, this passage, and told my story. And I preached this message about God revealing himself through his creation and how we as Christians had been so negative, even antagonistic towards this issue. It wasn't the best message because I was scared to death. You should never preach when you're really scared. Fear of God is okay, but fear of your people is not good. And I finished, and there was just dead silence in the congregation. The vineyard's about 3,000 people. And I got, in every service, the entire congregation stood up and gave me standing ovation. I've never had a standing ovation in all the years I've preached. And I realized they'd just been waiting to say it's okay to care about the creation and to do something about it. They say that there is a new evangelical emerging, a new generation, my children's generation, that are pushing politics aside. They're a generation that are looking for a deeper place with God. They're a generation that are looking for a radical call and a purpose to go serve him. And so we see the issues of justice and compassion and mercy emerging now in evangelicalism, and at the forefront of it, or in the midst of it, is this issue of environmental stewardship, because as we connect it to our ministry to the poor, and we have no question that we're not called to the poor, we see that one of the main drivers of poverty on this planet is a non-sustainable environment. Early on, when I first started in the ministry, we started in missions and went to the hill tribes of Burma, my wife and I and our kids. And I taught English as a second language for some time among the Karen people, who are persecuted people undergoing ethnic cleansing for the communist Burmese. And we lived in these villages and taught every day and watched as they would denude and deforest the canopy jungle around them so that they would slash and burn that they might grow one more year of rice. And I realized how much the environment is connected to poverty, because they would completely denude one area and move to another area and move to another area, and every time, literally, you couldn't hear a bird sing where there's once this deep canopy jungle. And so I knew if we're going to deal with this issue of extreme poverty, we've got to understand how important it is that we bring this value of creation care to the world through the church.